Welcome to episode 15 of Jacksonville Momcast. Today, our guest is Katie Roseborough, a Jacksonville mom and the host of the Sugar Mamas podcast. In this episode, we chat with Katie about her daughter's type 1 diabetes diagnosis and what made her decide to launch a podcast to help other parents. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Jacksonville Momcast, a podcast dedicated to real stories for real parents. Each episode, we'll chat with local Jacksonville moms and cover topics to help you navigate mom life on the First Coast. Thanks for joining us as we tackle all things motherhood and more with a focus on the 904. So welcome. Today our guest is Katie Roseborough. And Katie, let's start by telling us a little bit about yourself and your family.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm really excited to be chatting with you, and Jacksonville is my home and always has been. So just to be a part of this is really special for me. My name is Katie Roseborough. I am married to my husband, Will Roseborough. We've been married for about 16 years, and we have 3 kids. Nolan is 10, Sarah is 9, and Timothy is 7. Both my husband and I were born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. We're Jacksonville natives. I grew up out at the beach, mostly in Atlantic and Neptune Beach. He grew up sort of on like the Bay, more in the Bay Meadows area of town, kind of near like the Bay Meadows, San Jose area. We met, I was still in high school and he was in college, which a lot of people used to make a lot of fun of him for that. But now that we're older, the age difference doesn't matter. But we met when I was in high school and got married. We moved away from Jacksonville for a really short period of time for his job for about 2 years. And then we had our first child, Nolan, and we just always knew we wanted to come back home to Jacksonville. Our family was here. We just wanted to be close to grandparents and family. So we moved back home, and we have no plans of leaving Jacksonville ever, hopefully. Lord willing. I mean, you make plans and then life likes to change a lot on you, but I am a licensed physical therapist. I have an active license currently. I am not practicing at the moment. I kind of took a step back from that in March of 2019, just because life was crazy. My husband was traveling all the time for work, and I just needed a break. So I took a step back. I was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And then 2020, kind of like a year later, I was thinking, okay, like it's spring break, kids will be, out of school for the summer. And when they go back to school, I think I'll maybe start looking for something part-time. Well, then the world shut down because COVID-19, and then we were all homeschooling. So I didn't go back then. And then August rolled around and school was getting ready to start. And the day before school started, my daughter, Sarah, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So I was like, this is definitely not the time for me to go back to work. So I haven't been working working outside of the home, I should say, since I've been working my butt off, but I haven't been working outside of the home since 2019. And that's, we have a dog. I can't not mention Henry. We have a dog named Henry. He's a yellow lab, and he's my baby. So that's a little bit about us.
I love it. And so let's talk a little bit about your daughter's diagnosis, because you're the host of the Sugar Mamas podcast. And so tell us a little bit about your podcast.
Yeah, that would have been a good thing to mention. I'm the host of the Sugar Mamas podcast. I started it back in January, so about 3 or 4 months after my daughter was diagnosed. The podcast it's for moms and caregivers of type 1 diabetics. When my daughter was diagnosed, it was just incredibly overwhelming. I mean, I think a lot of people don't really understand diabetes, type 1 diabetes, and the difference between the types of diabetes. And I think myself included, before she was diagnosed, you kind of think like, well, it's just diabetes. Like, what's the big deal? But it's so much, and it's so overwhelming. And I can talk a little bit about, what it all entails in the episode in a little bit as well. But I just felt a huge pull to help other moms and caregivers who were helping to raise these children with this chronic illness. I just felt like I wanted to be a positive light for them. I wanted to encourage them. I wanted to equip them. I'm by no means a type 1 diabetes expert. I do think I have a little bit of an advantage over other families that are faced with this diagnosis because I do have a medical background in physical therapy, and I worked in a hospital for a long time, over 7 years. And so medical, lingo and terminology and just kind of anatomy and physiology comes pretty naturally to me. So I feel like kind of learning the type 1 life and the type 1 lingo and how to manage it. While it's not easy, I feel like it maybe came a little bit easier to me. So I just wanted to use that to help other moms and other caregivers who were dealing with this diagnosis.
And so, talk to me a little bit about your journey as a mom of a type 1 child. And you said she was diagnosed the day before school started. How does that impact your, I'm assuming the first day of school was a little different for you guys. So talk to us a little bit about, that initial shock and where you are now.
It was definitely shocking. I mean, to say the very least. Looking back on it now, you kind of think to yourself, how did I not see this? Because all the signs and symptoms were there. And we had gone on a vacation a couple weeks before she was diagnosed. And on the way home from vacation, my husband, being a typical dad, was like, okay, we're going to pack our lunches and we're only going to stop at rest stops and we're going to try to stop as little as possible. And we're going to make it home as quickly as we can, because it's a long drive. We were in Tennessee. It's a long drive back to Jacksonville. And one of the signs and symptoms of type 1 is excessive thirst and excessive urination. So all of a sudden we started noticing my daughter was asking to stop and use the bathroom a lot. I mean, normally on a road trip, I would say we'd have to stop once every maybe 3 hours or so to go to the bathroom. Well, it was like every 45 minutes. So, that's kind of my red flag was up on that drive home from that trip. And I was kind of thinking to myself, I need to keep an eye on this because in physical therapy school, I remember learning about the signs and symptoms of type 1 diabetes. We didn't spend a lot of time on it just because, you don't have to be an expert in that to be a physical therapist, but we kind of glossed over the diagnosis. So I remember those signs and symptoms, and I just had my red flags up. But it's also summer and, it's hot and she's drinking a lot of water and running around outside. And we kind of got home and got unpacked, and like a couple of days would go by and she seemed fine. And then I would notice it again and I would say, oh, I need to keep an eye on it. Maybe it's just a UTI. And it kind of went back and forth like that for a few weeks. And long story short, the day before school, we were out to dinner with my sister and my mom and the rest of, my kids. And she got up to go to the bathroom several times during that dinner. And my sister is actually a dietitian. She works with mostly type 2 diabetics in a renal dialysis center. So she is familiar with all the signs and symptoms. And she looked at me and she was like, what's going on here? And I was like, I know. And I was like, I'm going to take her in tomorrow. Well, this was actually 2 days before school started. So I was like, I'm going to take her in tomorrow, get her checked for UTI. And she's like, have you thought about diabetes? And I was like, yes, I have. I'm just really hoping that that's not what it is. My daughter was also extremely thin. She's always been really small. But looking back at pictures, she was like skeletal. I mean, that's another sign and symptom is weight loss because your body can't utilize the glucose that you're eating through food to get energy. So it starts to break down all your fat to get energy instead. So she was losing weight and losing fat at a rapid pace. So she was so skinny. Anyway, took her in the next day. It was type 1 diabetes. I mean, we found out very quickly. They rushed us. They told me to rush her. We didn't have to take an ambulance, but they told me to rush her downtown to Wolfson's and admitted us. And yeah, we had to spend 3 days in the hospital, and that's where she spent her first day of third grade. In that sense, the pandemic was a little bit of a blessing because if it had been any other year, virtual school wouldn't have been an option. and or at least not through her own school. You know what I mean? I know there's virtual options, but not through her own school that she was already enrolled in. So we started with her virtually. My other two boys went to school and in person, and she stayed home for the first 9 weeks while we kind of adjusted to our new life as a, as a type 1 family.
I was
Yeah.
just gonna say it's interesting. It's interesting to hear a benefit of the pandemic from your perspective. And
Mm-hmm.
I just spoke with another mom who had a child with a medical issue and ended up having to homeschool or not homeschool, but virtual school this year. And her perspective was that of all the years for something to happen, it's not even abnormal to have to pull your kid out to do virtual. It was just such an ordinary part of our lives. We had friends who did in person and friends who did virtual, and it was just the way it was. So, but looking at the pandemic, did anything that was going on last year impact your access to healthcare in terms of, how many visitors you could have at the hospital or being able to get appointments, things like that?
So visitors at the hospital, yes. Luckily, we've only spent the first 3 days of her diagnosis in the hospital. We haven't had to return to the hospital since then, thank goodness. But yes, only my husband and I were allowed to be there, but only one at a time. So we had to switch off, which wasn't the worst thing in the world, just because one of us was able to be home with our boys. So, we have a lot of family support in town. We could have certainly called on the grandparents, but being at the first week of school, it was nice that one of us could be home with them. The hospital visit was just so sad. I mean, if you know anything about type 1 diabetes, you have to take an insulin shot every time you are going to eat anything that involves carbohydrates. So obviously that's extremely overwhelming for a 9-year-old who doesn't even like to go get her flu shot once every year. Now she's having to take 6, 7, 8 shots a day of insulin to manage this disease. So that's obviously scary and overwhelming. And under normal circumstances, the hospital would have had, they have this giant game room that the kids can go and play in. They have like arts and crafts time. They have people traveling around the hospital playing music for them and doing all sorts of little things for them. But none of that was going on. All the games, we just had to stay in the hospital room and we couldn't leave. And it was just me and my daughter, or my husband and my daughter. And so in that regard, it was sad. Grandparents wanted to come and visit, her brothers wanted to come and visit, but they just couldn't. So, and it was short. It was only 3 days, but it was still hard for her family and friends that really loved her and wanted to be there for her, and they couldn't. So that was hard. As far as getting appointments, that was not challenging. That was fine. We were able to meet with doctors when we needed to. We were able to get prescriptions when we needed to. So that was good.
Good. I was just going to say, I'm sure it was hard for her too, to be going through all this and not being able to have visitors and not being able to, see people in person.
Yes, definitely. She would ask about it and I would just, remind her, no, sweetie, they can't, it's COVID. They can't come to the hospital unless they absolutely have to. And they were sending in little gifts for her. So that, that made her feel better. She was showered with all sorts of stuffed animals and, activity workbooks for her to keep her busy and everything.
And was she able to use technology and FaceTime people? And
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, she did virtual school for 3 days in the hospital. So she was using technology doing that. And yes, she was able to FaceTime with me and my husband when, one of us wasn't there, and the grandparents and her brothers. So yeah, she was able to see people through the screen.
That's nice. So now you have a child who has been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. Mm-hmm. Probably very overwhelming as a parent, even with a medical background, knowing, maybe even more so because more with a medical background. Mm-hmm. And she's doing virtual school for the first 9 weeks. You have 2 other children. At what point do you think, what would be awesome? Let's start a podcast. It just seems like such an overwhelming situation to then decide to throw something else on it. And we were chatting before we started the interview, but you produce a weekly segment. And so, we put out once a month, which I think is plenty, but you put out something new every single week for parents. And I'm just curious, what made you decide to do that? What was your thought process? I don't have enough to do, so.
Yeah, let's add one more thing. Yeah, good question. I love podcasts. I should probably start there. So I'm a podcast junkie and I'm also an audiobook junkie. And I think it's just because I love to read, but who has time to sit down and read a book? So I just like to pop in my earbuds, and I can listen to audiobooks and podcasts while I'm doing chores, while I'm driving in the car. You can have your hands free, but still be taking in, a good book or a good podcast at the same time. So there are a lot of really wonderful type 1 diabetes podcasts out there, but there was really nothing specifically geared towards moms and caregivers of type 1 diabetics from the perspective of a mom. I I just kind of had the thought. I also should mention that for about a year or maybe a year and a half, I did a little podcast with my kids. It's called Carline Chats with Katie and her kids, where I would just record conversations with me and my kids while we were driving to school in the morning, like once a week. And that was a very poorly produced show. I mean, it's really cute. It's still out there if anybody wants to find it, but I didn't edit it at all. I would just, some days you couldn't even like hear us talking. The windows were rolled down. One day we actually got in a car accident. Well, somebody rear-ended me. But like, it was just all that to say, it was just a very like spur of the moment, mostly unedited kind of podcast with my kids. I wanted a way to record conversations with them. So I kind of always had that in my blood, I guess you could say. And I had the idea of, I think it would be really great to have something for moms and caregivers, just as an encouragement and not only an encouragement. I mean, I have lots of guests on there who are very knowledgeable about type 1 diabetes and can give, good, solid medical advice, mental health advice, things like that. But just something for moms. So I brought it up to my husband, and I have lots of crazy ideas. So when I brought it up, I was like, oh, he's going to be like, here's one of Katie's crazy ideas again. But surprisingly, he was very much so on board. He thought that would be a great idea and was very supportive of me, which I greatly appreciate. And so we just got to work. I sat down and I wrote down a list of topics that I thought would be good to cover for that, listener population. And I probably came up with a list of, I would say, at least 80 things. And the list kind of just keeps growing. And I just started hunting people down. And I can't honestly believe that people said yes to talking to me when I didn't actually have anything to show them. I'm like, I'm doing a podcast. I haven't produced any episodes yet. Would you like to talk with me? And surprisingly, I've only actually had one person tell me no. And that's because they were like, no, I'm way too much of an introvert. Like, I cannot do that. It's like, okay, I get it. No worries. But yeah, I produce one episode a week. Topics are very varied. Sometimes I talk with other moms of type 1 diabetics, and it's really just us kind of talking through life and kind of things that they feel that they're really good at, and then things that they feel like they're really bad at. And we just kind of talk through it. Everybody has a story to tell, in my opinion. I've had a few people say, I'm just a mom of a type 1 diabetic. And I'm like, yes. And you have a story to tell. So I think with every episode that I record, there's always something that you can gain from it. There's a new perspective that you can take away from it, a new mindset. You can learn different ways that people do things, different ways that people look at things, because we all manage this disease differently. And I think it's beneficial for people just to kind of hear the story from another mom. I have healthcare professionals on talking about various topics. The list goes on and on.
I actually listened to a couple of your episodes kind of preparing for this interview. And I think one of the great benefits of your interviews is that your questions are genuinely coming from a mom with a type 1 child. And you can hear that in your conversations with people, and you can hear your concerns, and it's a nice perspective. And I definitely see how it could be such a great resource for for moms and caregivers that are going through that, because you are going through it in real time along with them.
Mm-hmm. And to kind of go back to your question earlier, I thought I was a little hesitant because I'm like, well, we just got diagnosed. Like, I don't really feel like I can be adding much to the conversation starting a podcast. Like, I barely know anything myself. Like, I'm learning also. But I kind of had the thought of, I think that would actually be beneficial to a lot of families, to kind of have that perspective of a newly diagnosed mom and family from the beginning, and then kind of follow that along their journey as they get more confident and get more experience. And I kind of liked that idea. I was scared of it at first, but then it grew on me. So I just decided to go for it. There's a quote that I really love, and I don't know who says it, so forgive me if it's you, somebody listening. But it's, if I waited until I had all my ducks in a row to cross the street, I'd never get across the road. So I kind of have that mentality in life of, you really only get one life. So if you have an idea and you want to go for it and it's not going to hurt anybody else, then go for it.
And I'm curious, in a couple years, once you've, become more of an expert in managing a child with type 1 diabetes, if you'll look back at those first few episodes and be like, oh, I can't believe I asked that I didn't know the answer to that question, or I can't believe how naive I was about certain things. But again, I think that that's what adds value to your podcast, is that, there's so many parents out there that have those exact same questions. Somebody needs to ask them.
Yeah, exactly. I'll be the one. I'll put myself out there. I'll make myself sound like a fool for the benefit of others.
And you don't sound like a fool at all, but
oh, thank you.
But so tell us, who's been your favorite guest, or what's been your favorite? I feel like podcasters have a favorite episode. I know I do. What's been your favorite episode or favorite guest?
Yeah, that's a really hard question, because I really and truly have loved every single guest I've talked to, which I think is a huge blessing. I'm sure there's a lot of podcast episodes that go really, really bad, but I feel like all of mine have gone really well. If I had to pick a favorite, there's really two. It's a tie. The first one is a lady named Andrea, who came on to tell me about her son, who he's now an adult. I believe he was diagnosed with type 1 when he was maybe 6, if I'm remembering correctly, but around then. And he had a service dog. He had a diabetic service dog. And I believe he got the dog when he was an early teenager. And he had the dog all through middle school and through high school. And so just hearing about the service dog and the training that's involved with that, and then bringing the dog into your home and having to, continue to work with them with training. I mean, it's I think everybody thinks like, oh, how fun, a service dog. Wouldn't that be so fun? But it is a lot of work. It's a huge commitment. And what these dogs can do is just absolutely fascinating. So I think that was probably one of my favorite episodes. And then I also got to interview a lady named Carol Kramer, who's the creator of a stuffed animal called Rufus the bear. And Rufus is kind of owned by JDRF, the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation. And anybody who's newly diagnosed, usually in the hospital or shortly after you get home, you will receive a Rufus bear. And Rufus also has type 1 diabetes, and he's covered in patches on his belly and his little booty, and different spots on his arm where you can practice your finger sticks, where you have to check your blood glucose level. And so the kids can practice like poking Rufus, and they can practice giving him their insulin injections. And it's just a really comforting thing for kids. My daughter loves her Rufus bear. So I got to interview the creator of Rufus, and that was a really fun interview. I was very honored to do that.
Those are great. I didn't listen to either of those episodes, so now I want to go back and listen to them. But we'll put links.
They're good ones.
We'll put links in our show notes to all your stuff, but we'll put specifically to those 2 episodes, since those were some of your favorites. Much like us, you started a podcast during a pandemic when it was hard to meet people in person. How has that either been difficult or made things a little bit easier when it comes to interviewing people?
Well, I think, like you had mentioned when we were talking earlier, everybody's really familiar with these virtual platforms now. for talking to people and recording meetings or podcasts or whatever it might be. So I think that made it easier for me to find guests because people were like, I kind of would say it's basically just like being on a Zoom meeting. I'm just recording the audio. So I think that made it a little easier for me to talk people into coming on the show because now everybody's familiar with all these virtual platforms. For me, it was a huge blessing because while we have a huge support system in town, grandparents, aunts, uncles, friends that we've grown up with our whole lives, I didn't know anybody that had a child with type 1 diabetes. So for me, getting to meet people, even though it's virtually, other moms and just other people that were connected to the type 1 community, it's really been honestly my lifeline over these past 10 months. I mean, it's just so nice to see another person's face and know that they're going through exactly what you're going through and they have kids that are dealing with what your child is dealing with. It's just been a huge blessing for me in a time of literal isolation because of the pandemic and then just kind of a mental isolation from, having a child with a chronic illness and feeling like nobody else around you is going through what you're going through. I had people all around me who were loving on me and supporting me and encouraging me, but at the same time I felt totally isolated in the world of type 1 because nobody else had a type 1 diabetic child like me. So
And I do think that that's, again, another thing, along with the virtual school that's come out of the last year, is that there's so much accessible right at your fingertips through technology.
Yeah. Oh, can I tell you a really cool thing? So we have met some families that have kids my daughter's age, and we've gotten to know them. And recently I had a lady reach out to me just via email. She was just super sweet lady, wanted to say thank you for the podcast and that it was really helping her and her daughter and, just sending a nice note. And she mentioned something about driving to Orlando. And I was like, oh, are you a Floridian? I'm in Florida too. And she was like, yeah, we live in Jacksonville. And I was like, we live in Jacksonville. And her daughter is the exact same age as my daughter. They both just finished third grade. So, I mean, what a blessing that is, and she had no idea I was in Jacksonville because I don't typically talk about that on the podcast. I mean, obviously people are going to know now because I'm on this podcast, but anyway, so we're actually getting together soon, later this week, actually, for our daughters to just kind of meet and play. And I just thought that was such a cool story,
It's fantastic that somebody reached out and they happen to be in your backyard. I mean,
I know, literally. Yeah.
That's so awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So what's your ultimate goal with the Sugar Mamas podcast? Like, where in the next few years, where do you see it going? Do you have any big plans for it? Or are you just going to continue publishing not just because once a week again is a huge undertaking, but what do you see in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I would love to just continue with the once a week episode. I mean, I don't see me being able to do more than that anytime soon. It's, as you know, it's a lot of work to record and find guests and then edit the show and produce the show. So it does take a lot of time. I really just want to reach as many families as I can and help as many moms and caregivers as I can. I think so far the podcast has been really well received. And so I just hope to kind of find more families to help and encourage. And I do have, starting actually this week, I'm starting a 10-week series for the newly diagnosed. And I have a certified diabetes care and education specialist who's also a registered nurse coming on. And we're going to do 10 weeks of different topics that would be helpful to newly diagnosed families. And I kind of want to do more series like that. I have a few ideas in my head about different 5 to 10 week series on varying topics, maybe do like a series once a year, or maybe even twice a year. And then the other episodes would be more kind of a random topic or random spread of topics. I mean, I would love to, like, there's a big conference in Orlando for children with diabetes. It's called Children with Diabetes. And they meet every summer. And last year, 2020, my daughter wasn't even diagnosed when they had it, and they didn't have it because it was virtual. And then this summer they are having it, but we're going to be out of town. So, I would love to take the podcast to like a conference like that and just have a booth where I could talk with other parents and meet more families and kind of network that way. I mean, I would absolutely love to have sponsors eventually because, I really enjoy it, but it is a lot of work. So I'd love to have this show sponsored by, different products that people use in the diabetes community or just things that would help moms and kids in general.
Those are some good goals.
Yeah.
So you have your type 1 daughter and 2 other children. You're an author, which we're going to talk about in a second, and a podcast host. How do you balance all of that? I mean, it's a lot just without even doing the extra. What are some tips you have for other moms to kind of find that balance? Or do you not? Maybe you don't have any tips. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Let's see. I mean, I get up really early. That's probably a practical tip that's somebody could translate into their real life. I mean, I get up early and I just start my day early. So that helps. You can get a lot done in the morning when no one else is awake. I've always been a morning person. I would be up at like 4:30 with my mom drinking coffee when I was 16 years old. So I've always been a morning person. I think that as I've gotten older, like I'm a recovering perfectionist and people pleaser. So I think it's gotten a lot easier as I've gotten older, actually, because you just kind of realize that you have to say no to things to keep your sanity, even when you don't want to. I mean, I have FOMO to the max, fear of missing out. And I just have had to train myself to say no. And, when we can, which I hate to do because a lot of times it lets other people down, but I kind of have to look at my family and our schedule and make decisions based on what's best for us and them and my kids, especially now that my daughter, a routine is key for managing blood sugar as well with type 1 diabetes. So we are very much so a go family on the go. And we've had to dial it back a little bit just to kind of stick to more of a routine and keep life a little less chaotic. I mean, I know it's hard for me to talk about this question, honestly, without mentioning my faith, which I hope that's okay. But I pray a lot. I mean, we have a wonderful church family. I get a lot of peace from that, from just my faith, and that just gives me a lot of peace. So I feel like I can kind of, even regardless of how crazy my day is going and how difficult diabetes is being that day, or, whatever it may be, I feel like I can always kind of center myself and find that peace through just prayer, or, I listen to a lot of worship music in the car when I'm not listening to audiobooks and podcasts. So that's really helpful. Yeah, I don't know. I just, I kind of just operate under the mentality of like, I just get one life. And so I'm just going to go for it. You know what I mean? Even if I'm exhausted, I'm just going to keep going. So
that's a great philosophy to live by. Because it's true. You do only get one shot.
One shot.
So I mentioned that you are an author. So tell us a little bit about your book. And then do you have any plans to use your talents to help other type 1 families?
Yes. So my book is a children's book. It's a children's picture book called There's a Mermaid in My Pool. And I wrote it. I kind of started writing it in December of 2019 and started the whole publication process a few months after that, after it was written. So maybe like February of 2020, right before the pandemic really shut the world down. And it was inspired by my childhood. I grew up, like I said, in Atlantic Beach. I had a pool in my backyard, and I just have the best memories of being in my pool. And I have a sister, and we would make up dances in the pool, like we were synchronized swimmers. We would, do plays in the pool, and oftentimes we would pretend to be mermaids in the pool. And those are just some of my fondest childhood memories. And so the idea for this book came from that experience. And it's about a little girl who just kind of skips outside one summer day, and there happens to be a mermaid in her pool. And so she jumps in, and, that's come to find out that's not all that's in the pool. There's like a whole ocean world underneath the water. So it's just kind of about their adventures together that day. And it was a very, very fun project to work on. I've always wanted to write a book. So to see it come to life, especially over the pandemic year that was already so dark and gloomy, see this bright, colorful children's book come to life. It was published earlier this year. It was published in March of this year. So it took a really long time. That was mostly due to COVID, because all the printing presses and distribution warehouses were shutting down frequently. And then it just launched on Amazon a couple of weeks ago. So it is officially launched on Amazon now. And I would love to use my writing talents to help other type 1 families. I've actually talked with the illustrator of the book, which I just love the illustrations in the book. I think they turned out amazing. And I've talked to him about, in the future, if I want to do a reprint, I'm thinking about, I definitely would not change the story to fit type 1 diabetes, but I might just put some of the gadgets on the little girl in the story, because type 1 diabetics, they don't have to, but if it's covered by your insurance, and if you choose to go this route, you can wear like continuous glucose monitors on your body at all times. So you've got that gadget. And then you can also wear an insulin pump if that's something you choose to do. So, my daughter wears both an insulin pump and a continuous glucose monitor all the time. So she has these, we like to call them robot parts, kind of sticking out of her body all the time. And I would just like to add those like to the girl in the story, and then have a page at the end of the book, after the story ends, kind of explaining, you may have noticed that the little girl in the story was wearing some devices, and just a paragraph or two about what they were, to raise awareness for type 1. And then I do have other ideas for stories in the future. They're not type 1 diabetes related, but again, I'd love to like put the gear, the type 1 gear on the characters in the book.
I love that idea. I think that's a great way to just, expose kids to what they may see on classmates in their classrooms, or, walking around Target if they have a child with a pump or with one of the patches. Like, I mean, what a great way to kind of foster that inclusion of those children with those type of gear. That's great.
Girls with gadgets. I like to use that hashtag a lot. Girls with gadgets.
I love that. And we'll put a link to your book also in the show notes. So if anybody wants to check that out, it's adorable. So it's makes a great gift for any kids that, love the pool. Like you said, I think pretty much anyone with a child in Florida can relate to the story. So in terms of type 1 resources here in Jacksonville, is there anything you recommend for parents that are, kind of like you, starting to navigate this path? Like, what here in town have you found to be your go-to resources for your family?
Yeah, so JDRF is huge. They have a local chapter, a Northern Florida chapter that is based here in Jacksonville. And unfortunately, I haven't really gotten to experience the fullness of that yet because of the pandemic, but I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I know that better days are coming, because they have a huge outreach program where they will match up families, and they'll organize get-togethers with different age groups, little kids, tweens, teens, young adults, things like that. Even adults with type 1 diabetes, they're great for that. They do this huge walk every year to raise funds for type 1 research. And I've heard that normally it's like a giant festival, and everybody gets together to walk, and you form teams. Well, this year they couldn't do that because of the pandemic. So, and the year before as well. So everybody was just kind of like doing their own walk virtually. So I think just reaching out to, and I can give you the contact information for a person as well, if you want to put that in the show notes, but reaching out to your local chapter of JDRF and just saying, hey, what is there for me? What kind of outreach activities are there, or meetups? What can we do? there's a parent Facebook group in Jacksonville for kids of type 1 diabetics. I can give you the link for that. And that's been a great resource for just, hey, I have a 9-year-old daughter that got diagnosed, last year. Does anybody want to meet up for a play date or get together sometime? Or, hey, I totally ran out of, Dexcom sensors, which is the continuous glucose monitor my daughter wears. Like, does anybody have an extra one until I can get our prescription refilled? It's a great resource for families. There is, again, they're not doing it this summer, unfortunately, but there's a camp called Camp Jada, which I hope I'm giving the right information, but it's through Nemours. So I've heard it's downtown, and it's put on by Nemours. So endocrinologists, nurses, certified diabetes educators, those are the people kind of running the camp. And it's a day camp. So, and I think it's a week long. So kids can sign up for that eventually when they start that back up. I've heard Camp Boggy Creek is amazing as well, which again, not doing it this year. It's all virtual, but don't lose hope, people. It'll come back one day. But they actually do a family retreat where your whole family can go for a long weekend to a camp, and all the other families have a child that has type 1 diabetes. And there's lots and lots of summer camps out there for type 1 diabetics where you can send your kid, and I mean, not necessarily in Jacksonville, but in the state of Florida and nationwide, where you can send your kid and they'll be with lots and lots of other kids with type 1 diabetes. My sister actually volunteered at one years and years and years ago as a dietitian. And she just was like, it was like the best week of my life. We had so much fun. So I think if you can get your kids into any sort of camp for type 1 diabetics, would be well worth it.
That's a great list. And we will put links to all that in our show notes so that any other
parents
are looking for resources.
Okay.
And do you have any advice for parents that are facing a type 1 diagnosis?
Oh gosh, I would just take it 1 minute at a time. It's incredible. It's an incredibly heavy diagnosis, honestly, because it affects every decision that you make, really and truly. So I would just tell them to take some really nice, big, deep breaths and take it 1 minute at a time. I would give yourself a lot of grace because it's really hard, especially in the beginning. It's incredibly hard to get like blood glucose levels under control. That first month is just a roller coaster. The whole disease is a roller coaster, but that first month especially is really, really challenging. So give yourself a lot of grace. I think a lot of people expect perfection, and it's just impossible to do because we're trying to play the role of a very complex organ, the pancreas. And, as much as we want to be a pancreas, we're not. So just do the best you can. Give yourself grace. Every day is a new day. If you royally mess up one day or 2 or 3 in a row, it's okay. You can start fresh the next day and just celebrate when you can, celebrate the good times. And we have a lot of sad times too. And in those moments, I just sit there and I let my daughter cry, and I oftentimes cry with her. But then we move forward. I just kind of remind her like, hey, it's okay to be sad and frustrated. Like, I'm sad and frustrated too, but we can't stay stuck here because, we got to live our lives, and we're not going to let diabetes stop us. So
I think that's some amazing words of advice for fellow parents that are going through this. Anything else you'd like to add before we finish up?
Gosh, I can't think of anything. You've asked such wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on. And, you can put my email, you can put it in the show notes too. If anybody wants to reach out to me, they are more than welcome to. I love hearing from parents. Be more than happy to talk with anybody who's facing this diagnosis or anybody who's been diagnosed for a really long time. I'd love to chat with them. So you can give them my email and they can follow along. I'm mostly on Instagram. I am on Facebook, but I feel like I'm more active on Instagram these days at Sugar Mamas Podcast. So have them reach out.
We will. And we'll put all that in our show notes to help people that want to find you. Thank you, Katie. And this has been another episode of Jacksonville Momcast. Thanks for listening. That's it for today. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Jacksonville Momcast. For more information about what you've just heard, Check out our show notes and find us on Instagram at Jacksonville Momcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and know someone who should tune in, please subscribe and share it. We look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Jacksonville Momcast.